All right, this is Brute Wolf. We're going on to the fourth episode of the Nehemiah class. Actually, I combined two of them in the first video, so this is the third video uh, going over the fourth lesson. First of all, this one is mainly about domestic affairs with Nehemiah. Let me just share the screen. I have not really rehearsed this ahead of time. I had it nice and ready to go Sunday, so hopefully I'll have enough memory left over from this. Prior to the class starting, I had a little discussion questionnaire at the bottom. What is more likely to cause a fight between a husband and wife? Dealing with some tough medical news or repainting the living room? And we came up on that question later on. Okay, so we're studying Nehemiah. Nehemiah is rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, but the city is under siege from 4 different armies. And this painting actually does a pretty good job of explaining what's going on. I'm going to go into it in more detail later on. I'm going to start off by reading from the end of Nehemiah and the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 4 and the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 5. But I'm going to change 2 words in the passage so that it'll make more sense, so that it makes the story more likable. And you can decide which words that I've actually changed. Nehemiah chapter 4, beginning in verse 14. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So we continued to fight, going on to verse 21. We continued the work. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and workmen by day. Verse 23, neither I nor my brothers nor my men nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when we went for water. And then on in chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their surrounding enemies. And that passage, as I have it written there, makes sense. They raised a great outcry against their enemies. They're under siege. They can't get food. But instead, what this passage actually says is the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. The only fight that's taking place right now is inside the wall. So let's go back and review exactly how we got here. With the pickle and the balloon. You got water on the left, brown on the right. In the middle, you draw a pickle holding a balloon. The pickle is the Dead Sea. The string is the Jordan River. And the balloon is the Sea of Galilee. And just to the left of the pickle stem, we get Jerusalem. This is then toward the very end of the Old Testament. Not much happens after this in the Old Testament. Toward the end of the Old Testament, remember your ABPs. A is Assyria, B is Babylon, P is Persia. The pickle and the balloon are now way over here in the land of Judah. There's the pickle, there's the Dead Sea, and up there is the Jordan River. And this is all the space they take up. The northern kingdom is gone because the Assyrian kingdom has taken them over and they have now vanished. The land of Judah, the southern kingdom, is the only thing that remains. Nebuchadnezzar and his men in Babylon then take the Israelites 900 miles from home to Babylon, where they stay there for several decades. Then they start coming back, and they again the ABPs, Assyrians, they took the northern kingdom. B, Babylonians took the Israelites over to Babylon. ABP, P is the Persians. The Persians then release them, and when we get to the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, King Artaxerxes is allowing them to go back. So the first man up is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel takes 40,000 people, takes them from Babylon back to Jerusalem to repopulate the city and build the temple. Several years later, Ezra goes back and dedicates the temple and sort of lays down the law and turns Jerusalem into not just a place with a lot of people, but he really helps rebuild it as a community. But it's still kind of a slum. They have this beautiful temple, but the surrounding walls have all crumbled, and so now onto the scene comes Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is going to go back there. The very last story in the Old Testament, even though the book is in the middle of the Old Testament, this story is the last thing that happens in the Old Testament. Nehemiah then comes onto the scene and gets there to rebuild the wall. And as they're building the wall, I got that up there too soon. As they're building the wall, I think we'll just do a stop sharing of the screen. I think that should be just back to me again. There we go. As they're building the wall. In chapter 4, it says that they're halfway there. So the bricks are are getting heavier because now they've got to get them up even higher to the people up on top. And you can see what they're up against. And it becomes obvious that this is not a story about geography. This is a story about God, like the Father, and like in Mitch's sermon on Sunday. God is like that prodigal son's father who's waiting for them off in the distance saying, you can do this. You can rebuild this wall. Come on home to me. And Nehemiah's job is to take the blinders off and realize they're not just looking at a temple. They're not just looking at a wall. They're looking at God himself. The first time I really gave any thought to this story, at least from a devotional standpoint, the story about Nehemiah, was probably when I first moved to Tulsa, and I was in my 30s at that point. And I thought, yeah, I can really relate to this, the wall being halfway up. Because when the wall's halfway up, that's when we moved here in 96, about 24 years ago. I've got finished my education. I'm about to start a career, married, just had our first kid. And you start thinking, yeah, I'm now kind of at that halfway point. We were at that stage in life. We were, one of the cute young couples, or people at church who would even call the group of us that. We were the cute young couples, the kind of people that if they were to make a brochure about the church or put a billboard of the church, out on the BA, they could use the two of us, goo-gawing over our little baby Curtis or little baby Braden. We'd be the one that they want. But now the strange thing is it's 20 some years later. I'm well into my 50s, but I still feel like I'm stuck in Nehemiah chapter 4. I still feel like the walls are just kind of still under construction. And it seems not right to me, really, that why we use the phrase middle age for this stage of life. Because when you get right down to it, I'm 55. If I'm middle aged, that means I'm going to live to be 110. So I'm probably past middle age. I'm fine with living to be 110. My goal is to live to be 110 and to die in a jet skiing accident. So if that works out for me, then great. But the problem is we are too far along to be one of the cute young couples. And we're not old enough to be able to get the youth group to mow our lawn for free as a service project. And so most of us are somewhere in between. We're not the cute young couple. We don't get free service from the youth group and counting it as a service project. If you've made it to that stage, good for you. You've definitely arrived. But it seems like in many ways in life that we're just kind of stuck in the middle sometimes for decades with our wall halfway up. The walls and the gates are still under construction. And as I think about some of the people throughout church, I realize I can see that. We have a lot of people who, we have one couple that may be worrying about their education, another one who's worrying about their kids, and another one who's worried about what's going to happen to their retirement. And it always feels like there's still just something else that's left to be done. And the natural thing for us to say is, let's carry each other's burden. Let's build each other up. But I have to say, at least in this the atmosphere right now with the coronavirus, I'm sick and tired of hearing that. If I hear one more commercial that starts off with that treacly piano music with little captioning that comes up, says, "We're all in this together. We're here for you," I just want to throw a brick at the TV. Tractor Supply Company has TV commercials now saying that they're here for me. I don't need them here for me. I don't need the people at Domino's here for me. I get the point. I'm ready for something a little bit more lighthearted. But it's gotten to the point that we've spent so much time saying, I'm here for you, that now even that has started to seem old. And when I look at the beginning and go through Nehemiah chapter 5, it kind of feels the same way. They are at war. They are in a famine. And the one time when they really feel like they need to be sticking together is the time that they're starting to fall apart. It's time that they're really getting sick of each other. And I don't know if it's actually going to work when let's find out. No, it's not going to work. I had a couple of poll questions that I did live for the class. I'll just read them to you here. And the first one was, which is more likely to cause a family argument? A, dealing with some tough medical news, or B, repainting the living room? And as you might guess, it was about 90% said that we're more likely to argue about repainting the living room than we are about how to handle some difficult medical diagnosis. And the second question was kind of similar. Which is more likely to split a church? Which is more likely to cause a split in a church? Is it A, a failed mission plant, a failed church plant, or a failed mission team in Central Africa, or B, disagreeing on how much to spend on a church kitchen. And for that one, we probably had 40 votes, and it was, I think, 99. I think one person voted for the mission. 39 out of 40 people said the one that's more likely to cause a church split is disagreeing on how much to spend on a church kitchen. And why is that? I think when we talk about, which is harder, repainting the kitchen with your spouse or dealing with a tough medical advice, when it's bad medical news, the cancer becomes the enemy. But when you do a repainting, we become each other's enemies on how it should be done. So a better way to think of it is let the ugly room, let the bad peeling paint job become the enemy. And when that becomes the enemy, rather than we become the enemy of each other, it's easier for us to move forward. Same way with the mission in Africa. The enemy of that mission in Africa should be lost souls. But too often we think of it as being something political that they're not dealing with properly. But the kitchen, that's harder, because we think of the kitchen, we think of our priority as being what the real difficulty is, when in fact, the enemy in a church kitchen and building a church kitchen, the enemy should be hungry people can't get food, or the brothers and sisters can't fellowship together. Both of those are really important. So moving on to our next thought, the slide that I already tipped my hand on a second ago. I've never been to war, but I think it's reasonable, it's probably a reasonably safe bet that I never will. But I do think that it'd probably be easier for me now than it would have been when I was 20. I think at 20 I was more terrified of it. Now I would rather do it just because I don't want my kids to go. And it seems like a more natural thing for me to want to do. This is called a Higgins boat. And as you know, on June 6, 1944, 50,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel over to France to storm Omaha Beach and begin the D-Day invasion. Now, put yourself in this boat. Imagine that you are the captain of, that you are running this group of people. This thing can hold about 30 men, as you can just about see that in this picture. Imagine that you're floating through on this boat. You can see the beach ahead of you. You know that there are German snipers with their guns pointed who haven't started shooting yet because you're not close enough. You know that when you hit the beach, this front end is going to come down and all the men are going to have to jump off. And you know when that happens that you're sitting ducks for a few seconds until everybody's off. And now, as you're sitting there manning this crew, one of your soldiers looks up at you and says, Sarge, excuse me, but I don't have any M&Ms in my lunch bag. I'm supposed to have M&Ms, but there's no M&Ms there. And you're thinking, you idiot, will you just be quiet? We're about to get shot at by soldiers. We need to focus on this. But then the guy next to him, the soldier next to him says, wait a minute, I don't have any M&Ms either. Where are my M&Ms? Somebody's taken the M&Ms. And they start looking around and says, let's go through everybody's pack. Somebody here has stolen all the M&Ms. Now, take the feeling that you would have. Let the scenery melt away. And instead of floating on the English Channel in the middle of war, instead, it's 400 years before Christ, and you're standing on the Jerusalem wall trying to get an organized project going here. Now, this painting is actually a pretty good indicator of what's going on. They try to put in all the details. This is probably supposed to be Nehemiah. Now, it got to the point they have enemies on every side, from the north, south, east, and west. And so he had to take half of his workforce that was supposed to be a 2 mile, probably 2.5 mile total wall being built, where all the men are spread out far apart. And of course, a lot of women are helping build too. And he had to take half of the workforce off of this project. And instead, like this guy over here, he's not building. He's got a bow and arrow in his hand over here to the far left. Instead, he's got half of them that are standing guard in case one of these armies decides to come in. The other half, as seen here, this guy who's on the ladder, the Bible says basically that they had a sword in one hand and a brick in the other. So you can see he's carrying bricks up this ladder, but at the same time, he's got a sword in his hand. Everything, now is where they've got the trouble. Now is where they've got 4 different armies around them. And here's what it looked like. Okay, so you've got the Samaritans to the north, the Ammonites to the east, the Arabs to the west, the Arabs to the south, and the Ashdodites to the west. So another way of thinking it is, you've got the American army, the Chinese army, the British army to the south, the Russian army to the west, and in the middle, you've got a junior ROTC class trying to do a shop project at the same time. What's even worse is that all 4 of these armies had some real incentives to try to destroy Jerusalem. They did not want these people back. The Samaritans, of course, were enemies for centuries and centuries, and will be a few hundred years from now. Jesus will talk about the Samaritan, because people usually didn't think too highly of Samaritans. Down to the south, the Arabs, of course, they've been enemies since the time of Egypt, and they are still at each other's throats today. To the west, you see the Ashdodites. Ashdod was an important city in Philistia. So the Ashdodites, these are basically Philistines, the same kinds of people that were fighting King David. Over to the east, the Ammonites. The Ammonites are an extinct species of marine invertebrates closely related to clams and oysters. At least that's as far as I got with my studies, and that's what it said on Wikipedia. If you know more about Ammonites and want to tell me, be my guest. But that, I really just wasn't that curious beyond that. Now, Nehemiah is trying to get everything squared out. Stop the share. There we go. Is trying to get everything squared out, and he's run into a new set of problems. Because now think about the people up on top of this wall. By the time you get to the top of the wall, the bricks are getting heavier, so now the work is harder. And now they're up on top. They can see off to the horizon. You've got enemies north, south, east, and west. You've got this going on. Now think about it. All these armies are surrounding them. What does that mean? They no longer have a supply line. They no longer have a way of getting food in and out. So the people are starving. The people inside are starving, so they go to borrow money from the wealthy people that are in Jerusalem. You've got the wealthy people there. People with enough money are loaning them money at interest. Some of them have even gotten to the point that they have collateralized their house. They've given up their house in order to get food. And then what happens was obscene. It would be as if Tom McLeod, Tim Maynard, and Joe Reese came knocking on your door, and you're sitting at home one afternoon, you hear them knock, you answer the door, and you look at them, you know exactly why they're here. They said, and you just look at them and say, I know, I don't have the money, I am so sorry. Here's the keys to the house. But then they look back at you and they say, no, we don't want the keys. We're here for your kids. Give us your kids. When you've got the money, you can have the kids back. But we need them. We're going to put them to work. Now, if I had been an advisor in this environment, if I'd been an advisor to Nehemiah, I would have said, we are at war right now. You are not going to have, there are no winners in this argument. You're going to have enemies either way. Do not touch this issue until we've got the wall built, until we've got the war, until we've got this war thing settled. Give it a few weeks. And then after that, in the meantime, we can make sure that nobody starves. We can make sure that everybody's okay. Let's settle it later. And that would have been good advice, but not great advice. And a leader who would take that kind of advice typically is not going to get a book named after him in the Bible. Because instead, what happens is that Nehemiah stopped everything. And Nehemiah then said, sorry about that. Nehemiah then basically said to them, and he goes back into the first person again. He said, I was very angry. And he basically says to them, you guys are enslaving your own people. You're treating your own people like garbage. And if we're going to do this, this wall can crumble for all I care. we've got problems right here to take care of. The law that they were violating was not, it's a passage in Leviticus. It's Leviticus 25. That law does not say, thou shalt not charge interest to thy neighbor. The law that they were violating, the way it's written, sounds almost like something Jesus would have written. Do not fall under the illusion that Jesus invented love. Jesus did not invent love. He perfected love, but love is all over the Old Testament, and people just simply couldn't see it. And that passage, Leviticus 25, 35 and 36, and again, you can imagine Jesus saying this. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor, help him as you would help a stranger and sojourner so he can continue to live among you. Do not take interest of any kind from him, but fear your God so that your countrymen may continue to live among you. The heroes for this morning are not, the heroes from this morning, this time is not Nehemiah. The hero this morning are the Israelites, the ones who were willing to say that they were wrong. Nehemiah brought them out in public. They admitted what they did was wrong, and they took a public oath in the middle of the town to say, we are sorry, this will not happen again. And the people were allowed their kids back, they were allowed their homes back, etc. That is the kind of servants that God wants. God is not after somebody who gets a book of the Bible named after him. Ultimately, he is about a servant. He is about someone who's willing to be who's willing not only to be forgiven, and is willing to ask for forgiveness, and is willing to say it, not just God, forgive me of my sins, but to go to an actual person to whom you have sinned against, to whom you have hurt, and say, I am sorry. You were right. I was wrong. Let's get back to building. I hope you join me next week on Sunday, or tune into the next video if you're watching these on archive. And we'll have an awkward pause as I figure out how to stop the recording. Have a good day.